discuss the aspects related to mountain occupation from the perspective of the Southeastern Alps, and this is a very rich region with a very rich evidence, as we were saying. And we will also discover that mountain areas in general had a major role in the occupation in islands, and a major role for hunter-gatherers. So we will discuss especially about hunter-gatherers and mostly about the late hunter-gatherers, so late Paleolithic and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. So mountain areas. So you see here a map of the main European mountain areas. Mountain areas are usually considered as harsh territories for human occupation, since due to their complex topographies, to their variable climatic conditions and more difficult climatic conditions. Nonetheless, mountain areas have and still have a very important role for European groups, but also for other continents like in Asia or America, etc. Because these areas are usually very rich in several resources, and some of these resources were very important for also for hunter-gatherers populations, like specific abiotic resources, for example, rocks, cherts, or minerals like ferruginous minerals, what we call ochre, and even biotic resources, and mountains where as mountains can have a very strong, are strongly influenced by seasonality. Some areas were particularly exploited during the summer and the springtime, and this could allow also, so this seasonal occupation could allow regeneration, for example, of plain territories occupied by hunter-gatherers. Moreover, mountains and are also, although they are sometimes considered as geographic barriers, they also are important connecting corridors for communication between different groups. Among the different mountain ranges, European mountain ranges, the Alps are certainly the main one, due to its to their position, their geographical position, and due to their altitudes, and also strong geological variability. As you know, the Alps are the main, have this tip at this arched conformation. They reach a very high altitudes, so they really separate the continental Europe from the Italian peninsula. And especially during the last glacial maximum, and generally during different glaciations, so the Alps really constituted a barrier for people who were living on the opposite sides of the Alps. Other mountain regions had, of course, different roles during prehistoric times and during historic times. If we consider the northern part of Europe during the last glacial maximum, this was completely covered by glaciers, while other mountain ranges like the Pyrenees, which reach lower altitudes than the Alps and are also located at different latitude allowed communication even during the last glacial maximum. So each mountain range has its typical confirmation and had a very different role during prehistoric times. When we speak about the Alps, we know that the Alps were occupied in prehistoric times since the Paleolithic, and actually the most ancient evidence of occupation of the Alpine region it can be referred to the Middle Paleolithic. So we have evidence of the Middle Paleolithic occupation by the Neanderthal groups, and we also have some evidence of occupation of the Alps by early Homo sapiens during the Aurignacian. Nonetheless, occupation related to these groups and to these periods is mostly located in the peripheral areas of the Alps, and we can also speculate that most of this evidence was destroyed by the last glacial event. So the last glacial event, which had its main peak around 23,000 years ago, was a very big phenomenon that involved a very important development of glaciers all over the Alpine chain, with glacial glaciers reaching the plain on both sides of the Alps, which of course prevented any occupation by human groups from at least possibly starting over 30,000 years ago until 70,000 years ago. So this was a very important phenomenon. Starting from around 70,000 years ago, at the beginning of the late glacial, the Alps could be progressively reoccupied by human groups. So in this case, starting from the late glacial, we know that we have increasing data, and we will examine the data we have, which show that starting from the late glacial, there was a phase of intense occupation of the Alpine range by the last hunter-gatherer groups. And the richness of this evidence may allow to investigate different aspects of the human occupation and different aspects related to the role that this mountain range had for hunter-gatherers populations. On the left here, you can see a map of northern Italy and all the Alpine of the Alps, also including part of Switzerland and part of Austria and Slovenia. And you can also see these yellow dots, which indicate the main sites that have been identified in this area. And as you may see, although I must tell you that all sites that are present on the French side are not plotted in this map. Nonetheless, as you can see, there is a progressive reduction of the evidence starting from the southeastern and generally the eastern Alps towards the western Alps, and also there is a different density of sites looking at the northern and the southern side of the Alps. So this differential distribution of sites In this case, we have mapped here sites which are related to the Mesolithic occupation, so starting 11,500 BP to around 7,500 BP. So the difference in the distribution of these Mesolithic sites is could be, of course, biased by several factors, and these factors may be related to differences, climatic differences, topographic differences, geological variability of these territories, but also the visibility of the record and also the intensity of research that was carried out in the different areas of the Alps. Actually, as you can see, we have areas with the richest record and areas with less dense record, but there is, of course, it is very clear from this map that the southeastern side represents the area with the richest evidence. So we will focus on this rich evidence, and we will try to analyze different aspects of occupation in this area, and starting from the late glacial towards the Mesolithic, and to analyze, to discuss the state of the art on this occupation, and also the perspective, the future perspective related to our knowledge on mountain occupation by the last hunter-gatherers. So this area is particularly known also from the point of view of paleo-environmental and paleoclimatic aspects. As you can see from this figure, the southeastern Alps started to be deglaciated during the millennia around 19,000, 18,000, and starting from this period, conifer woodlands started to expand in the area, so glaciers started to reduce and the vegetation to diffuse, to spread over the area. This improvement in environmental conditions allowed the first hunter-gatherers that were settled in northern Italy to reoccupy the southern Alps. During the late glacial interstadial, dated around 14,000 cal-BP, there was a spread of broadleaves, and the limit of the tree line reached 1,700 meters. So conditions were not as the one we have today yet. Nonetheless, the Alps became a very important territory for human occupation. There was a 1 millennium of broadleaf forest reduction corresponding to the younger Trias, so between around 12,800 to 11,600. And then at the beginning of the Holocene, there was a clear increase in temperature in temperatures, which allowed the spread of broadleaf forests, and the forest to reach the highest limit at 2,300 meters in the southern Alps. So we see that in when we during the late glacial, we have in Europe the last Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, while in the first part of the Holocene, we have the Mesolithic groups. So this is the period when the Alps started to be reoccupied by human groups, while, as we were saying before, we just have a much more limited evidence for previous periods. This is why we are focusing our attention on the late hunter-gatherers and on the Mesolithic groups, on the late Paleolithic and the Mesolithic groups. The first discoveries in these areas occurred in the valley bottom, in the Adige valley bottom. So the Adige valley bottom is located here. This is one of the first investigated area. And these discoveries are dated to the end of the 60s. And you see here two of the main sites, Valle di Zambana and Romagnano Block 3. These two sites were first investigated by Professor Alberto Broglio from Ferrara University, and who left us just a few days ago. So he was the one who, for the first time, identified the Mesolithic in Italy, and he identified the Mesolithic exactly in the Adige Valley, so inside the Alps. These two sites still have a great importance for the knowledge of the first Alpine dwellers, since they have yielded very thick stratigraphic sequences covering the whole Mesolithic period, and even going through the early Neolithic and sometimes later prehistoric periods. So these, actually we have three sites, Romagnano, Vatte and Pradestelle, and their importance is still great, since, as you see also from these dates, which are here given in Calbc, cover really the whole Mesolithic period. Actually, occupation in the Adige Valley started sometime earlier, as we know from another site located at the entrance of the Adige Valley, Soman rock shelter, in which we also have occupation in the late Paleolithic. So since the late Paleolithic, hunter-gatherer groups entered the Adige Valley and started to reoccupy the Alps. Although this phenomenon is also known some millennia earlier than in Soman, in the area of the Lessini mountain, and namely in the site of Riparo Tagliente. So human reoccupation in the Alps is a progressive phenomenon that really started during the late glacial and had, as we will see, its maximum development during the early Holocene with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. These were the sites located in the valley bottom, but in the 70s, also the first sites the first upland sites were identified. The first upland sites were identified by local amateur in the area of San Martino di Castrozza at altitudes around 1,900 meters at the Cobricon Lakes. Exactly 9 sites were discovered around the lakes and in the main crests that surround the two lakes. This allowed Bernardino Bagolini and Giampaolo Dalmeri to produce the first comprehensive work on the sites, the Mesolithic sites of Cobricon, which was published in 1987 on the Italian journal Prehistory Alpina. The hypothesis done by the two scholars was that The sites located around the lakes were mainly subsistence sites, base camps, while the sites located on the crests were hunting stands. Together with these island sites, these open-air island sites, in the following decades, several sites were discovered in the highlands on the southeastern Alps. And some of these sites are located under large rock boulders, like Plan de Frea, which was excavated in the 80s and the 90s, and Mondeval de Sora, also excavated between the end of the 80s and the 90s. So, as we can see, highland sites, in this case are all Mesolithic island sites, were located either open air or under rock boulders. Generally speaking, the first archaeologists who carried out their researches in this area, like Alberto Broglio and also Antonio Guerreschi, could identify recurrent settlement patterns, and the fact that these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers used to settle in very recurrent positions, so around lakes, under rock boulders, near important passes that were also the areas where the herds of animals, of ungulates, crossed. So important areas for hunting. Rock boulders certainly offer more detailed and better preserved conditions than open air sites. Actually, in the two sites of Plan de Frea and Mondeval de Sora, opposite to open air sites, we have also preservation of dwelling structures built by dwelling structures, so a specific organization of space under the rock shelters created by these boulders, like the presence of post holes, for example, at Plan de Frea, or a paved area at Mondeval de Sora, and also preservation of fauna remains. And this is also another very important aspect, since whole hundreds of Mesolithic island sites, open air island sites, did not yield fauna remains. So at the end of the 90s, thanks to archaeological activities carried out by these archaeologists, a vertical seasonal model was established concerning occupation of mountain environments in the southeastern Alps. The hypothesis that was proposed, especially by Alberto Broglio, was that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were settled in the valley bottom sites during the winter, and they used to occupy highland territories during summer periods for hunting, ibex hunting especially, and that the main river systems like the Adige or the Piave or Tagliamento were the main mobility routes of groups that moved from valley bottoms to highlands. Also, they proposed an hypothesis of a trend towards sedentarism during the late Mesolithic due to a reduction in the presence of highland sites in the last part of this period. So this was the state of the art at the end of the 90s. But starting from 2000, new activities was carried out, and the University of Ferrara, and as well as also the Museum of Natural History of Trento and the University of Trento, continued their research in the Alps, and And of course, these led to partly review the first hypothesis that was proposed in the 90s. This revision of the vertical model is going to be carried out thanks to an increase in multidisciplinary investigations, which include raw material analysis, reconstruction of reduction sequences of lithic assemblages, user studies, studies on new categories of materials like brownstone tools, osseous assemblages. So the information, the data we now have on the occupation of mountain environment is greatly increased in the last 20 years, and this is leading to a review of the paradigm. Moreover, new discoveries were carried out in these two last decades, which of course are adding new information, new data for the reconstruction of human occupation in this territory. In this map, you can see the distribution. So this is an updated map with the distribution of the late Paleolithic sites, which are indicated by the red dots, and the Mesolithic sites, which are indicated by yellow dots. So this includes the Alpine area, but also the area, the plain area in which is located the south of the Alps, and included between the Alps and the Adriatic Sea, where we also have Mesolithic evidence, but so far no late Paleolithic evidence. The evidence from the Alpine area is for sure the richest one. You can see that we really have some hundreds of sites. You should consider that most of these sites are known only by surface collections, but we also have several tens sites that have been excavated. So our data are quite rich. Starting from this map, we can also see that that these sites are located in very varied positions. So we have a group of sites that occupy the high plain and the pre-Alpine plateau. Then we have some group of sites that are located along the main river systems, and especially along the Adige River, as you can see here. And then we have also inland sites and highland sites, which are located quite inland in the Alps, reaching in the Mesolithic the innermost areas of this mountain chain. The red dots corresponding to the late Paleolithic sites are much less dense than the Mesolithic dots, so this could indicate an increasing in the occupation of the Alps starting from the late Paleolithic to the Mesolithic period. And even there is evidence for a progressive increase in altitude of this occupation, which seems to follow in the highlands the increase of the tree line. Usually, island sites are located in both periods close to the tree line, so in the band of territory between the tree line and the alpine prairies, which allowed good visibility on the territory and could allow hunters to hunt different prey. So now I will present some new data concerning the occupation of this region from research carried out in the last decades. One of these discoveries is the site of Casera Staulanza, which is located in the high Piave River Valley. It is located at an altitude of almost 1,700 meters, and it is close to the large pass, called Staulanza Pass. This site was explored between 2011 and 2018, and the importance of the site is related to the fact that it is referred to a late Paleolithic occupation. So this site testifies that hunter-gatherers reached altitudes as high as 1,700 meters in the late Paleolithic. This is really one of the very few sites at this altitude, and this is the only one that was explored over this large surface concerning the late Paleolithic. So it will give us, it's giving us several information on the late Epigravettian groups that occupied these areas, showing that they could reach very inland areas since the late Paleolithic, and that the position of the site located near this main pass could allow them to move around the area and to successfully hunt different prey. Further studies were carried out also in valley bottom sites. Among them, there was one main site that was recently excavated in the Adige Valley bottom. This is the site of Galgenbühel, which was excavated under the direction of Ursula Wierer. And this site is very important as it documents with great detail the early Mesolithic period, part of the early Mesolithic period, and for its excellent preservation of faunal remains. This site shows that occupation in the valley bottom was very strongly related to the presence of damp areas and also we can say lakes that were located at the beginning of the Holocene in the Adige Valley, and which allowed Mesolithic hunter-gatherers to predate animals such as the beaver, but also animals living in the forest like wild boar. But what is very important is what is very interesting is the exploitation of all resources which are related to damp areas, as the beaver, as we said, but also freshwater shells, mollusks, and fish. And the analysis of different both of malacofauna, fish remains, and bird remains also allowed to reconstruct seasonality in this valley bottom site. Actually, the main data obtained was that seasonality was particularly important during the spring and summertime. So this information could contradict the hypothesis that valley bottom sites were used as winter sites, but indicate that valley bottom sites were also, or at least were important location for summer and spring occupation, possibly strictly related to highland sites. Further evidence comes from the mid-altitudes. So we can say that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers occupied the highland areas in the Alps at 2,000 meters, but also they continued to occupy mid-altitudes, like in the pre-Alpine area, as it is the case of the Cansiglio Plateau. In the Cansiglio Plateau, which is located north of Venice, we have several open-air sites which document a strong interest in the occupation of this plateau, both by early and late Mesolithic groups. These plateaux were also important for their rich chert resources, and you can see here one of the important discoveries, which was published in 2006 by Peresani, of a small cache of flint nodules, chert nodules, inside a bog, which was really well preserved. So this middle mountain occupation shows that the first Alpine settlers, so the settlement models of the first Alpine settlers was more complex, more articulated than the one of the simple vertical mobility between valley bottom winter and summer highland sites. Further information concerns the way these people moved around in the area. This comes from two main researches, one carried out in the Adige River system and the second one in the Upper Piave system, so two of the main river systems of the southeastern Alps. We know that river systems were the main routes that allowed this group to reach the uplands, and once they reached the Alps, they moved around, keeping the same, some trajectories that we still use today, the same paths that are still used by modern people, which correspond to highland areas over the tree line, which also allow the minimum displacement, vertical displacement, and therefore what we can define as the lower cost path. This is a very recurrent model, which was identified through plotting, by plotting several tens sites, both in the Adige and in the Piave Valley, as you can see here. Further information comes from analysis in studies in some important sites, and we can say that the site of Mondeval de Sora, located 2,130 meters above sea level, is certainly the best preserved site, that's the best preserved highland site in the southern Alps, and possibly the best preserved highland sites in the Alps, Mesolithic Alpine sites in the Alps. So investigation in this site and continuous studies, continuous ongoing research in this site allowed to obtain new data also in the most recent years. This site is particularly important for its excellent preservation conditions. which allowed also the preservation of dwelling structures, a paved area made with tufa slabs, local tufa slabs, delimited by an accumulation of dolomite blocks, and also the preservation of an extremely rich lithic assemblages, mostly represented by microlith and projectile elements related to hunting activities, and the preservation of faunal remains. Preservation of faunal remains is very important, since this the preservation of faunal remains suggests that two main preys are present, ibexes and red deers. So these two species were those that were the most hunted by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, while smaller side species like chamois, and in some cases also the bear could be also part of these the hunting activities of Mesolithic groups. Studies related to lithic raw materials in the site of Mondeval de Sora, which is located here in the Belluno Dolomites, show also can give us important keys to understand the mobility of these groups, which was strongly related in the early Mesolithic to the Piave River system, which was the main system that allowed this group to reach the inner Dolomites, but also the presence of and the use of rock crystal identifies relations with the inner Alps, where this raw material crops out. So this could indicate very wide mobility of Mesolithic hunter-gatherer groups inside the Alps, and strong knowledge and intense exploitation of the local resources. Moreover, the recovery of one specimen of Columbella rustica from the northern Adriatic Sea, of course, relates this occupation to the occupation of the plain area and of course, the coastal areas of the Adriatic Sea. So we were discussing about differences in the lithic technology between the first and the second Mesolithic, so the early and the late Mesolithic, and this important change is related to the introduction of new napping techniques, especially of punch technique in direct percussion and the pressure technique, which allowed the production of a very regular blades and bladelets in the late Mesolithic, and also a change in the projectile typology, like triangles, which were progressively replaced by trapeces. So the site of Mondeval de Sora is also very important, since it gives us information on this very important change. Since in this site a burial was discovered, and a very well preserved burial excavated in 1987 by Antonio Guerreschi, with an excellent preservation, considering that it was located at around 2,000 meters. And this individual was a male individual, around 40 years old, with a very rich set of great goods, around 60 objects. These objects can give us important information on the ways of life, the lifestyles, and the technology of these late Mesolithic groups. So among the 60 objects, nine cores were identified, and several blades, and these cores indicated that they were produced, and bladelets were produced with pressure techniques, especially the small cores. For the bladelet cores were exploited by pressure techniques, while the large blades were obtained by indirect technique. Moreover, these cores indicate wide provisioning areas. These cores are characterized by very high quality, and after the studies carried out by Stefano Bertola, he could trace the provenance of the raw materials in the Adige Valley, in the Lessini area, the Known Valley, and the High Friulian Plain, with a very accurate selection of good quality cherts. Even in the burial goods, some tools related to napping, especially these antler tines that were interpreted by, after the studies carried out by Emanuela Cristiani, as punches and as pressors. So the discovery in the site confirms the use of these two techniques, and especially the production of small bladelets with pressure and of large bladelets with punch technique. These are three of the large blades found in the site, produced with the punch technique. These three blades have a particular importance since they were located in the upper part of the body of the individual. Two blades were located over the shoulders. One blade was located under the head. So these blades had probably a very symbolic importance, and considering also their association with cores and napping tools, we can say that these blades had a meaning which was related to the new techniques that were introduced in the late Mesolithic, which allowed the production of these large irregular blades, and which in one sense could actually revitalize the symbolism of the large blade that was present, for example, in the mid-Upper Paleolithic. This is the famous burial of the prince with the large blade in his hand. But this tradition of positioning blades in the burials disappeared during the late Paleolithic and the early Mesolithic, and was again reintroduced in the late Mesolithic thanks to the introduction of the new techniques, and also continued possibly in the early Neolithic. So in our latest papers, we proposed that the symbolism of the large blades could be an attribute for male individual who had a recognized prominent social position, or an attribute for specialized nappers, as probably the man of Mondeval was. Other important implements which were part of the grave goods, among the other important implements, there is this barbed point. This barbed point is related to fishing, and studies carried out by Emanuela Cristiani could establish that in the second part, in the last part of the early Mesolithic, these barbed points were widely introduced in the Alpine area, and probably related to the exploitation of freshwater resources and specifically fish. We are getting to the end of this presentation. Sorry, we are a bit late, but we had this problem of connection. So further evidence concerning this occupation comes from another site, which was excavated under the direction of Dieter Schäfer in Austria, the site of Ullafelsen in Tyrol. And this site is of great importance since it attests that raw materials, lithic raw materials and scherts come both from the northern and the southern Alps. So this indicates that Mesolithic hunter-gatherer groups had already crossed the Alps around 11,000 years ago, and that their knowledge of this environment was really very deep, and that they could exploit all the resources of this area. The last point I would like to discuss is actually the problem we still have, so concerning the settlement system of Alpine hunters. Since, as we saw from one of our first slides, we have a lot of sites in the Alps, but we also have sites in the plain, in the Venetian and Friulian plains, which we have also investigated with a very high density of lithic assemblages, poor preservation and almost absence of organic remains, but the high presence of lithic assemblages testifies for very intense occupation of these areas. But which was the role of this area? So one of the questions that still remain open is whether we in the Mesolithic we have groups that are specifically exploiting mountain areas opposed to groups that exploit plain areas and coastal areas, or if this was part of a unique settlement system with groups moving from the coast and the plain towards the mountains. This is a big question, and so far we do not have data to answer it. To sum up, the last discoveries in the Alps and ongoing studies attest that island occupation and inland penetration in the southern Alps started very early, much earlier than previously thought. So by the end of the Paleolithic, groups had already reached altitudes as high as 1,700 meters. That there was a continuity of occupation between the early and the late Mesolithic, so late Mesolithic groups continued to exploit island areas, although there was possibly a more specialized exploitation of these territories in the late Mesolithic with respect to the early Mesolithic. That mobility of hunter-gatherer groups was related to the main river systems when they moved from lowland to highlands, and to the main ridges in the uplands. That Sauveterrian technology shows exploitation of local resources, while in the late Mesolithic, so this is the Sauveterrian, is the early Mesolithic technology allowed the exploitation of and especially was focused on the exploitation of the local resources related to each single river system, while in the later Mesolithic there was wider provisioning territory related to the selection of higher quality rocks. The shift to the late Mesolithic was a phenomenon that involved the local population, and that would also engender social differentiation as craft specialization, as it could be testified by the burial of Mondeval de Sora, and this individual could be interpreted as a specialized mapper, and possibly also a more logistical system in the late Mesolithic with respect to the early Mesolithic. And then we still have several open questions. Among this question is the settlement system of this group, and specifically the relationship with the plain and mountain sites. If these were part of separated settlement systems or a unique settlement system relating these two territories. So acknowledgement to several institutions that are supporting research in the Alps under the ministry, under, of course, the ministry of all these activities carried out under the Ministry of Italian Culture. And thanks a lot for your attention.